Boulder Mountains, Montana, September 1880. The air held the first clean, sharp promise of winter, a crystalline edge that made the vastness of the sky feel personal and threatening. Down in the valley, men were chinking cabins, stacking cords of firewood higher than their roof lines, preparing for the siege. But up on the high shoulder of the granite massif, one man was doing something else entirely. Something that made the seasoned prospectors and teamsters who passed on the trail below stop, stare, and then laugh. Sigurd Halland was backing his Conestoga wagon, stripped of its wheels and tongue, into a deep, shadowy alcove in the rock face. Using a system of log rollers, heavy ropes, and a capstan winch anchored to a ponderosa pine, he inched the heavy wagon box deeper and deeper into the mountain's gut. The process was agonizingly slow, punctuated by the groan of wood and the shrill scrape of the wagon's oak frame against the granite floor. Pierce Beckworth, the mineral claim recorder for the district, reined in his horse, his ledger book balanced on his thigh. He was a man whose world was ordered by maps, lines, and legal descriptions, and what he was witnessing defied all known logic of frontier construction. He watched for a full 10 minutes as Sigurd, a quiet man with a solid frame and pale Nordic eyes, methodically reset a lever. "Halland," Beckworth called out, his voice echoing slightly in the cirque. "What in God's name are you doing? That's a wagon, not a badger. You can't live in a hole in the ground?" A few other men, hauling supplies up to a mining camp, had also stopped. One, a burly teamster named Jedediah Potts, spat a stream of tobacco juice. "Heard about this," Potts grunted to his companion. "The Norwegian's gone mad, thinks his wagon's a seed, and he's planting it for spring." Sigurd paused, wiped a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand, and looked out at them. He offered no defense, only a simple statement of fact. "It will be warm," he said, his voice calm and carrying a thick Hardanger accent. Beckworth shook his head, a look of genuine pity on his face. He made a note in his log, not of a claim, but of a folly. The consensus was clear, spoken aloud by Potts and nodded along by the others. The man was a fool, and his family would pay the price when the real cold came. He was building a tomb, not a home. What did this Norwegian shepherd mason, a builder of high-cirque huts or fjellstuga, understand about geothermal anchoring that these experienced, practical men of the American West had missed? What secret was held in the silent, colossal mass of granite that he was entrusting with the lives of his wife and children? The answer to that question would not only redefine survival in that brutal landscape, but would also be sketched into the notebooks of lawmen and filed away in the official records of the territory. If you stick with us, I promise you will learn a fundamental principle of thermal science that is as relevant today as it was in 1880. We love unearthing these lost stories of ingenuity. If you do too, consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the like button. And let us know in the comments, what's the most unconventional shelter you've ever seen or heard of? Sigurd Halland was not a carpenter. He had never framed a salt box house, never dovetailed a log, never raised a barn. His hands were not trained in the geometry of milled lumber and iron nails. He was a man of the fjell, the high treeless plateaus of western Norway. He was a shepherd mason from Hardanger, and his trade was the art of wetting small timber bodies to immense rock cavities. His tools had been the star drill, the sledge, the stone boat, and an innate understanding of how solid rock behaved. In the high cirques where his sheep grazed, he had built and maintained the small stone huts, the fjellstuga, that offered refuge from sudden violent storms. He didn't build against the mountain. He built with it, letting the billion-ton mass of granite bear the force of the wind, while a small, carefully insulated wooden interior held the precious heat for a shepherd caught in a blizzard. He had come to America with his wife, Solveig, and their two young children, Lars and Ingrid, drawn by the promise of land and the towering mountains that reminded him of home. But the mountains of Montana were different. They were drier, the winters colder, the cold more patient and profound. Their first winter had been a lesson in this new kind of cold. They had arrived too late to build, forced to winter in a hastily constructed lean-to, a pathetic structure of green pine logs and canvas. It was a disaster. The cold was not a force. It was a presence. It seeped through every crack, radiated from the frozen ground, and consumed firewood with an insatiable appetite. Sigurd remembered one morning with a clarity that felt like a brand on his soul. The temperature had dropped into the -20s, and he had woken to find the pewter button on his wool coat, which he wore even in sleep, had frozen solid to the fabric of his shirt beneath it, a cold, hard disk against his chest. He remembered the campfire smoke refusing to rise, instead creeping flat and heavy along the frozen ground, as if the air itself were too dense and cold to permit its ascent. When he walked, the pine needles under his boots didn't crunch. They snapped with the sharp, brittle sound of shattering glass. Solveig had tried to keep a brave face, but he saw the fear in her eyes as she wrapped Lars and Ingrid in every spare blanket they owned, their small faces pinched and blue. The children were always coughing. There was never enough warmth. The fire was a tyrant, demanding constant feeding, yet giving back only a small circle of heat that seemed to shrink by the hour. All their energy went into the simple, desperate act of not freezing. By spring, Sigurd had sworn an oath to himself. He would not fight the Montana winter on its own terms again. He would not build a flimsy wooden box and try to heat the entire outdoors. He would use the knowledge of his ancestors, the wisdom of the Fjellstuga, and he would ask the mountain itself for shelter. The conventional wisdom in the Boulder Mountains was to build with what was abundant, lodgepole pine. The standard cabin of 1880 was a box of notched logs, often hastily assembled with minimal chinking. The gaps were stuffed with mud, moss, or whatever could be found, which would inevitably dry, shrink, and fall out. The roofs were sod or rough-hewn shakes, offering little in the way of insulation. The floors were packed earth, or for the more prosperous, rough planking laid over open ground, a direct conduit for the cold. These cabins were thermal sieves. Their failure was a matter of simple, brutal physics. Heat, following its inexorable law, moves from hot to cold. A stove burning inside a cabin at 60 degrees Fahrenheit, while the outside air was -20 degrees Fahrenheit, faced an 80-degree temperature differential. Every square inch of the cabin's surface, walls, roof, floor, windows, was a battlefield where precious BTUs were lost to the frigid air. The primary enemies were conduction and convection. Conduction was the heat physically passing through the solid log walls. A 6-inch pine log has an R value, a measure of thermal resistance of about 6. For comparison, modern insulated walls have R values of 19 to 30. The heat simply bled through the wood. Worse, however, was convection, in the form of drafts. Cold, dense air is heavier than warm air. It poured into the cabins through 1,000 tiny gaps around doors, windows, and between the logs. This created what frontiersmen called the cold creep. The air at floor level could be 20 or 30 degrees colder than the air at head height. Families lived with perpetually cold feet, their lower bodies chilled while their faces were flushed from the stove's radiant heat. This constant infiltration of cold air also had to be heated, placing an impossible demand on the wood stove. A family might burn through 10 or 15 cords of wood in a single winter, a monumental task of felling, bucking, splitting, and stacking that consumed the entire autumn. Even then, comfort was a fantasy. Survival was the goal. On the coldest nights, water buckets froze solid indoors, a few feet from the glowing stove. Ink froze in its well. Bedding grew stiff with frost from their own breath. The conventional cabin wasn't a shelter from the cold. It was merely a slightly less cold version of the outdoors, a place where the wind didn't blow directly on your face, but the cold still owned you. Sigurd saw this endless, losing battle for what it was. A flawed design, a fight against physics that could never be won. Sigurd spent the late summer scouting, not for timber or a flat patch of land, but for rock. He walked the granite ridges, his eyes scanning for a specific formation, a deep, stable, dry alcove, a natural cavity carved by ancient glaciers. He found it on the north side of a cirque, a granite hollow, its mouth about 12 feet wide, its floor nearly level, extending deep into the mountain. He sounded the walls with a hammer, listening to the solid, dead ring of billion-year-old rock. It was perfect. The first step was preparing the wagon. He and Solveig carefully unbolted the heavy running gear, the wheels, axles, and tongue. What remained was the Conestoga's box and its curved hoops for the canvas cover. This box was a marvel of frontier craftsmanship, its floorboards thick, its sides angled outwards to keep cargo from shifting. It was, in essence, a sturdy, pre-built wooden room, 18 feet long and about 4 feet wide at the base. Then came the Herculean task of moving it. Using pines felled for the purpose, he created a slipway of peeled logs leading into the cave's mouth. With a block and tackle secured to a massive boulder deep inside the alcove and the capstan winch outside, he began to haul the wagon box into the mountain. Solveig, Lars, and Ingrid helped gather smaller stones to act as rollers, their small hands doing what they could. The scraping sound of oak on granite was terrible, a protest of wood against stone, but inch by inch, the box slid deeper. It took 4 days of relentless, laborious, back-breaking labor to position the wagon box fully inside, its rear wall touching the back of the hollow, 18 feet from the entrance. Now the real work of the Fjellstuga began. He didn't have quarried stone, but he had the next best thing, the earth itself. He constructed the front wall, the plug that would seal the mouth of the alcove, using a technique he knew from his homeland. He built a 2-foot-thick wall of sod bricks, cut from the rich meadow turf below. He laid them like masonry, grass side down, alternating the seams. The space between the inner and outer faces of the sod wall he packed with a dense, heavy mixture of clay and gravel, creating an almost monolithic barrier. This wasn't just a wall, it was a mass, 2 feet of solid earth that would store thermal energy. He left only 2 openings, a small, heavily insulated door and a carefully sealed hole for a metal stovepipe. It was during this phase that Pierce Beckworth made his most pointed criticism. Standing with the district surveyor, he pointed a gloved finger at the overhanging granite brow above the alcove. "I've recorded dozens of claims in country like this," Beckworth announced, with the authority of his office. "A wagon driven that far under overhanging granite will be flattened the first thaw. The frost heave cycle in this rock is powerful. It'll drop 1,000 pounds of stone right on his roof." He looked at Sigurd, who was meticulously packing clay around his stovepipe. "You're placing your family under a deadfall, man." Sigurd paused, looked up at the granite brow, then back at Beckworth. He didn't argue about geology. He simply said, "The mountain has held that stone for 10,000 years. I think it will hold it for 1 more winter." He then turned back to his work, leaving the recorder and the surveyor to shake their heads at his stubborn foolishness. The final touch was inside. He stretched the wagon's original heavy canvas cover taut across the curved hoops, but this time on the inside of the box, creating a curved inner ceiling. This formed a crucial air gap between the canvas and the wooden roof of the wagon box, another layer of insulation. More importantly, it dramatically reduced the volume of interior air that needed to be heated. He wasn't trying to heat the entire wagon box, just the living space below the canvas, a cozy, tent-like tunnel deep inside the rock. When Solveig saw the finished interior, she touched the canvas ceiling, then the cold, solid granite wall that formed one side of their home. "It is strange," she said, her voice soft. "It feels not like a house, but like the inside of a pocket." The mockery from the valley lasted through October. The validation would last for a century. The key to Sigurd's strange structure wasn't just that it blocked the wind. The secret was the mountain itself. The men in the valley thought of the ground as cold, something to be shielded from. Sigurd, the shepherd mason, knew the ground was warm. This is the principle of geothermal anchoring. Everywhere on Earth, just a few feet below the surface, the temperature of the ground stabilizes. It escapes the wild swings of the air temperature, moderated by the immense thermal mass of the planet. In the Boulder Mountains of Montana, at a depth of 15 to 20 feet, the granite holds a steady year-round temperature of approximately 42 degrees Fahrenheit. This number is the secret to everything. To a man freezing in minus 39 degrees Fahrenheit air, 42 degrees Fahrenheit is not cold. It is a profound, inexhaustible source of heat. A conventional log cabin standing alone in a field is an island in a sea of Arctic air. It loses heat from its four walls, its roof, and its floor into that minus 39 degrees Fahrenheit environment. The temperature differential is immense, as much as 100 degrees, and the cabin bleeds BTUs, the basic unit of heat energy, at a catastrophic rate. Sigurd's wagon home, however, was not an island. It was a peninsula. Three of its sides, the floor, and the two long walls of the wagon box were pressed against, or in close proximity to, a mass of granite that was holding steady at 42 degrees Fahrenheit. Instead of losing heat in those three directions, his home was either neutral or actively gaining a trickle of thermal energy from the mountain. The only surface exposed to the brutal outside air was the 2-foot-thick sod and clay plug he had built. That massive earthen wall had a huge thermal mass of its own, meaning it took a very long time to get cold, and once warmed by the stove, it would radiate heat back into the living space for hours. The physics were undeniable. Let's imagine the fire goes out. In a conventional cabin, the indoor temperature would plummet, quickly matching the outdoor temperature, a deadly drop to minus 39 degrees Fahrenheit. But in Sigurd's shelter, if the fire went out, the temperature would only drop until it began to approach the temperature of the surrounding rock. The granite, at 42 degrees Fahrenheit, would constantly bleed a small amount of heat into the space, preventing the air from ever plunging into life-threatening territory. The laws of thermodynamics dictated that the air inside the hollow could not get significantly colder than the massive object surrounding it. Even with no fire, the ambient temperature inside the wagon would likely never fall below 28 degrees Fahrenheit. For Sigurd, this meant the baseline for survival had been completely redefined. He wasn't starting from minus 39 degrees Fahrenheit and trying to heat his home by 100 degrees. He was starting from a stable base of nearly 30 degrees Fahrenheit and only needing to add another 30 or 40 degrees with his small stove for comfort. The difference in fuel consumption would not be a matter of percentage, it would be an order of magnitude. He had turned the mountain from an obstacle into a furnace. That November, winter came not as a gradual decline, but as a hammer blow. A vast, stagnant bubble of Arctic air, a northern high, settled over the northern Rockies. For 18 consecutive nights, the official temperature recorded at the assay office down the trail was minus 39 degrees Fahrenheit. The air grew utterly still, so dense and cold that it pooled in the valleys and cirques like invisible water. There was no wind, no drift, just a silent predatory cold that seemed to suck the very sound from the air. In the settlement, smoke from chimneys, which usually billowed and dispersed, now rose in single, pencil-thin, unwavering threads, visible for miles against the pale, unforgiving sky. For the families in the log cabins, it was a time of misery. The cold was a physical entity, a thief that found every crack. Men spent their days feeding stoves and their nights listening to the wood of their cabins groan and pop in the intense cold. The frost built up not on the outside of the window panes, but on the inside, thick and feathery. It crept across the walls, coating nail heads with white blossoms of ice. At the Miller homestead, their entire winter's supply of potatoes, stored in a cellar beneath the cabin floor, froze solid. Silas Croft, the carpenter who had privately called Sigurd's design a death trap, woke to find a skin of ice on the water in the wash basin, less than 6 feet from his roaring stove. The battle was constant, exhausting, and despite burning wood at an alarming rate, they were losing. Up in the granite hollow, a different reality prevailed. The contrast was absolute. Outside, the world was frozen to the temperature of iron. Inside Sigurd Halland's wagon home, life went on with a placid normalcy that would have been unthinkable down below. The small stove glowed, but it did not roar. A single, small log could keep the space at a comfortable 60 degrees for hours. The air was still and dry. There was no cold creep on the floor. Here, the proof of success wasn't just in the numbers on a thermometer. It was in the mundane details of domestic life. Solveig sat on a stool mending one of Lars's shirts with bare, nimble fingers, no need for gloves. The children, Lars and Ingrid, were not huddled around the stove, but were playing quietly on a bearskin rug on the floor, drawing on a piece of slate. The air was so calm and draft-free that the flame of their single tallow lamp did not flicker. But the most definitive proof was on a small, sturdy work table Sigurd had built at the back of the wagon. Sigurd was a practitioner of the new, difficult art of photography. He used the wet plate collodion process, a method that required coating a glass plate with a syrupy, light-sensitive chemical mixture, exposing it in the camera while still wet, and developing it immediately. The process was finicky, even in ideal conditions. In the cold, it was considered impossible. The collodion would freeze on the glass, the developing chemicals would become inert, and the image would be ruined by a crystalline pattern known as frost grain. Every tintypist and photographer at the assay office and in the larger towns had already packed their chemicals away for the winter. Yet here, in the back of a wagon buried in a mountain, Sigurd Halland worked on his craft. He could be seen in the lamplight carefully pouring the viscous collodion onto a glass plate. The liquid flowed smoothly, evenly. It did not freeze. The air in his workshop, 18 feet deep in solid granite, was stable enough for the most delicate of chemical processes. He was capturing stark, beautiful images of the frozen world outside from the impossible warmth of his rock-bound studio. This was the ultimate proof, not just warmth, but a functional, stable environment where delicate work could proceed, even as the world outside was locked in a crystalline stasis. The single thread of smoke rising from his stovepipe was not a sign of desperation. It was a declaration of victory. On the 12th day of the Arctic high, a man named Agent Thorne of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency was tracking a fugitive who had robbed a stagecoach near Butte. Thorne was a relentless pursuer, known for following his quarry into the harshest terrain. But the cold was a more formidable adversary than any outlaw. As dusk fell, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of violet and bruised purple, Thorne's horse went down. Its leg had gone stiff, a condition frontiersmen called ice knee, a freezing of the joint's synovial fluid. The horse was done. Thorne was now on foot, miles from any known settlement. With the temperature plummeting and night closing in, it was a death sentence. He climbed a small rise, his lungs burning with every breath of the razor-sharp air, and scanned the horizon. It was a desolate, white wilderness, and then he saw it. Miles away, rising from a fold in the mountains, was a single, impossibly thin, perfectly vertical thread of smoke. It didn't waver or bend. It was the only sign of human activity in that entire frozen panorama. With nothing left to lose, he oriented himself by it and began to walk. It took him nearly 2 hours, stumbling through the deep, powdery snow. He was near the end of his endurance when he finally found the source. It was not a cabin. It was a mound, a plug of earth and sod set into the base of a granite cliff, with a stovepipe poking out of it like a strange metallic reed. A dim, warm light glowed from a tiny window set in a small wooden door. He collapsed against the sod wall, his hand falling near the stovepipe. It was radiating a gentle warmth. Hope surged through him. He knocked on the door, his knuckles numb and clumsy. The door opened, and a block of yellow light fell across the snow. A stocky man with pale eyes looked out at him. It was Sigurd. Thorn, expecting to be blasted by a gust of frigid, smoky air from a failing fire, instead felt something utterly baffling. It was a wave of calm, still, dry warmth. There was no draft. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke, coffee, and warm bread. Sigurd helped the half-frozen agent inside and sat him on a stool near the stove. Thorn's mind, trained to observe detail, struggled to process the scene. A woman was humming quietly, rolling dough on a small board. 2 children slept peacefully under a wool blanket, and at the back of the long, narrow space, glass plates were arranged in a drying rack on a workbench. Thorn, a man of the world, recognized a photographer's studio. Here, in this, he had expected a desperate hovel, a smoky pit of suffering. He had found a sanctuary. Sigurd handed him a steaming mug of coffee. "You are lucky," Sigurd said simply. "The air is still tonight. Easy to see the smoke." Thorn looked around the space, at the smooth granite wall on one side, the curved canvas ceiling above, the thick earthen plug at the front. His practical mind raced, deconstructing the design, understanding the genius of it. He looked at the placid, comfortable family, and then thought of the howling void he had just walked through. He took a long sip of the hot coffee, the warmth spreading through his chest. "You haven't built a shelter," Thorn said, his voice raspy with awe as he looked at Sigurd. "You've built a season." He stayed the night, sleeping more soundly than he had in weeks. Before he left at dawn, armed with a meal of bread and dried venison and directions to the nearest trail, the Pinkerton agent, the man of facts and evidence, took out his official notebook. He did not write a report about his failed pursuit. Instead, he asked Sigurd to make a sketch. Sigurd, on a clean page, drew a cross-section of the wagon in the alcove, the sod wall, the canvas ceiling. He added dimensions and notes in his careful, slightly blocky handwriting. Thorn studied it, folded the page, and put it in his breast pocket. It was more valuable than any bounty. When the great cold broke, news of the Pinkerton's survival and his strange refuge began to circulate. Agent Thorn was not a man given to exaggeration, and his story, told in the saloons and boarding houses of Helena and Butte, carried the weight of authority. He described the Norwegian who lives inside the mountain, a man who had defeated the winter not with a bigger fire, but with a better idea. The story became a piece of frontier lore, passed from prospectors to trappers to surveyors. Pierce Beckworth, the claim recorder, heard the story and was deeply skeptical, but he was also a man of empirical evidence. One afternoon, he rode up to Sigurd's Hollow. The thaw had begun, and there was no sign of the rockfall he had so confidently predicted. He found Sigurd outside, cleaning a glass plate in the wan sunlight. Beckworth dismounted, his demeanor stripped of its former condescension. "Halland," he began, "they're telling stories about you down in the valley, about a Pinkerton agent." "He was cold," Sigurd said, not looking up from his work. "Now he is not." Beckworth gestured toward the alcove. "They say you were comfortable through the whole spell." He still couldn't quite believe it. For an answer, Sigurd simply wiped his hands and led Beckworth inside. The recorder stepped from the muddy, melting world into the calm, dry interior. The air was cool now, the stove unlit, but it was not the damp, bone-chilling cold of a cellar. It was the neutral coolness of a natural cave. Beckworth ran his hand along the granite wall. It felt cool but not icy. He saw the workbench, the evidence of a winter's worth of delicate work. He understood. His professional expertise had been based on structures that fought the environment. This structure didn't fight. It cooperated. His prediction of a collapse had been wrong. His assessment of the design, a complete failure. As a man of public records, Beckworth felt a duty to codify what he had learned. He asked Sigurd for a copy of the sketch he had given the agent. A week later, in the large dusty ledger at the territorial recorder's office, among the plats for silver claims and water rights, a new, unusual entry appeared. Beckworth filed the drawing under the heading Shelter Precedent, Halland Geothermal Anchorage. He had given it a formal name. By documenting it, he transformed it from one man's strange folly into an official piece of recognized frontier innovation. The oral spread continued, driven by Thorne's retellings, and by the following autumn, 4 separate parties heading into the high, unforgiving country of the Bitterroot Range had adopted variations of Sigurd's design, seeking out rock hollows for their winter camps. The simple design of the Fjellstuga, brought from the mountains of Norway to the mountains of Montana, anticipated the principles of modern earth-sheltered construction by nearly a century. Today, architects and builders use the same concept, geothermal anchoring, to create highly efficient homes that require minimal energy for heating and cooling, their stability drawn from the constant temperature of the earth. Sigurd Halland's story endures not just as a tale of survival, but as a profound lesson in perspective. The other settlers saw the mountain as a barrier, a thing of brutalist indifference, an obstacle to be endured. They built their shelters in defiance of it. Sigurd saw the mountain as a partner, a reservoir of stability in a world of violent flux. He didn't build a cabin against the mountain. He asked the mountain for 3 walls and hung the 4th himself. He understood that the greatest forces in nature are not to be fought, but to be harmonized with. True genius, on the frontier as now, is not always about inventing something new, but about seeing the resources that have been there all along with fresh eyes. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. We hope you found it as inspiring as we did. Please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories of forgotten history and timeless wisdom. Let us know in the comments if you think this kind of earth-sheltered building could make a comeback today. Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, while the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices and knowledge. Any application of these or similar building techniques in a modern context should be undertaken only after consulting with qualified professionals and in accordance with all current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.